big thank you to all of you for coming along here this evening, because we live in very interesting times, shall we say. Last year we won the leadership of the Labour Party, and I say we because, as Diane quite correctly says, this isn't about any one of us. It's about the direction our society goes. It's about the direction our politics goes. We have all lived through a period when there has been austerity imposed upon the poorest in this country. That austerity continues and is possibly going to get even worse following the vote last week and the government's current economic strategy. It goes back further than that. It goes back to a time before some of us in this assembly here today were even born. That is the 1970s, when Reaganomics took over in the United States, and the idea being that you roll back the state, you reduce taxation, that would encourage economic growth and everybody would be better off. Margaret Thatcher put it more deftly, saying it would be a trickle-down effect. If the rich got very rich, the poor would get a bit too, because every rich person needed a maid or something like that. It's the economics of a limited supply of wealth to the poorest. This was then accompanied by privatisation of public services, accompanied by a rolling back of the whole principles of the welfare state. In a sense, the post-war construct of a welfare state society, of housing, of education for all within our society, and of course the health service. That process has gone on with interruptions at various times, and the crisis of 2008-9 showed just how fragile that economic model was, that unless you invested in economic development, in a manufacturing economy, a sustainable economy, then everybody was at risk as a result of it. And so, in the last general election, 2015, both major parties were offering a form of austerity to the British people. Some very severe austerity, in the case of what the Conservatives were offering. In the case of the Labour Party, our offering was unfortunately limited, in that it said there would be cuts in some areas, but there would be growth in other areas. We weren't offering a redistribution of wealth. We weren't offering a redistribution of power. We weren't offering enough, or indeed very much, to the very poorest, most dispossessed communities in our society. And so we thought it would be a good idea if the Labour Party last May, only a year and a bit ago, instead of having a leadership contest, actually engaged in a very deep and serious political discussion about the direction of the trade unions, of the left, of the Labour movement. That didn't happen. Instead, we had a leadership contest. I was asked to enter that leadership contest. I did so and attempted to promote those very important values. And that resulted in a very big increase in party membership. Now, well over 400,000 people are members of the Labour Party. And it also meant there was a very big participation in politics, not just by young people, but by older people who had become disillusioned, people leaving, coming back, all that. Very, very important, that participation in politics. And that's been a very positive thing. And I was very determined that from the moment we were elected, and I say we because it is not about an individual, it's about all of us, would change the economic direction. We would challenge the politics and the economics of austerity and say it for what it is. Austerity is a political choice, not an economic necessity. And it's that political choice which has caused so much damage to the lives and livelihood of many of the worst off within our society. But I also wanted to change the way that we did our politics. Far more participatory, far more bringing in people who've got ideas, who may or may not go to fine universities like SOAS or anywhere else, but also would have good ideas even if they've never been to any university. Bringing people in, letting people's ideas flow. So we have imagination in the way that we do things. But we do this with some principles. The principle being that an economy must work for all, not just for the few. A successful economy is one that reduces inequality, that does provide for full employment, that does use the skills of everybody to contribute to the good of all of us. But also the principles of how you go about doing things in society behind it. So, a health service as a human right, free at the point of use, not as a source of cash for the privateers who want to take over. Yeah. I'm very proud that Diane Abbott, as our new Shadow Secretary of State for Health, absolutely is pursuing that policy. But she's also pursuing, in parallel with that, a policy on the mental health services. There is a mental health crisis in this country. 1 in 4 of us, at some point in our lives, will face a terrible crisis. Too many people, sadly, often young men, take their own lives because they're in a bad place, can't talk about it, haven't got the support they need. So we, as a community, all have a role in that. No more the abuse of people with mental health conditions. Yes to reaching out and supporting people. So we all have a role in that. And then we move on to the other areas of policy making that are so important. And I've mentioned economy, I've mentioned health, and absolutely I talk about housing. We have a government, this Tory government, pursuing a new Housing Act. The Housing Act that requires councils in what they call high-cost areas to sell off their most valuable properties. To anyone who gets a bit of promotion at work and earns a reasonable living, suddenly has to pay a near commercial rent for a flat that they've lived in for a very long time, or a house in which they're council tenants, and not give councils the support and finance they need to build council housing. So you deliberately create a crisis of shortage, a house price bubble for those that want to buy, and for the rest, they're forced into an unregulated, private rented sector, and in the case of London and our big cities, with rents that are completely unaffordable for anybody on an ordinary or average income. So this then amounts to social cleansing in the central parts of our big cities. So how much different it would be if instead of pursuing that policy of the science of shortages, we instead produced a policy which was of a national endeavour to ensure that we conquered the housing crisis by building, by regulating and by providing housing for all. That's all very well, but those policies aren't very appealing to the wider community and wider electorate. I simply say this: many people have very good moral values and very deep consciences. Is anyone who lives comfortably in a nice house, in a nice area and all the rest of it, really happy to see destitute people sleeping on our streets, to see people homeless, often through no fault of their own, but because they've fallen through a series of tests and traps that were set for them, which they could not meet? Wouldn't it be better if we had the moral value as a society to say, everybody should be housed. Every child should be able to live securely in a clean, dry, warm house, the better to do their education, the better to achieve and contribute within our society. And so that and many other issues are what we stood for this election on. 2 other things I want to mention before I conclude. One is the environment and the world in which we live. We often pay lip service to the environmental consequences of what we do. We have to recognise we cannot go on destroying the planet at the rate we are. We cannot go on polluting the air, polluting the sea at the rate we are. We have to live in a different and more sustainable way. It doesn't have to be a threat to everybody. It doesn't have to be a threat to everything we do and every way in which we live. It has to be a determination that we use the technology that is available for us to use our resources better and more sparingly, and develop a much more sustainable form of economic development. So I was very pleased when John McDonnell did an environmental audit of the last budget. And I want us to have a government that does an audit of its own work, does an audit on its effects on the environment, does an audit on its effects on poverty and inequality within our society, and does an audit on social dislocation in our society. So we actually set ourselves very tough targets of how we go forward. Environmental issues are absolutely crucial, and I want them to be centre stage in what we do. There's something unbelievably unwise in, for example, so underfunding our solar industry and wind industry that it's almost closed down in some parts of the country because the government doesn't have the stomach, the interest or whatever to do it, and instead wanting to build very traditional, very expensive power stations. There is a different and a better way of doing things if we're all going to survive on this planet. Internationally, we look at the refugee crisis across Europe and around Europe, and we look at that refugee crisis and we see desperate human beings trying to survive in a very cruel world. The refugee crisis will not be solved with tear gas, barbed wire and electronic surveillance. We have to reach out and ensure there is a European-wide approach to the crisis we're facing, and a foreign policy and international policy agenda which is fundamental about human rights and rights of people. Rights of people to live, rights of people to express themselves, to demonstrate, to follow their faith, any of those things. Last week, it's all right, let our friends say it's fine. It's all right, let our friends say it's fine. Last week there was a vote to leave the European Union. It wasn't my wish, it wasn't the wish, I suspect, of a large number of people here. And we now have a difficult economic situation we have to deal with, and I was trying to call this out today and demand that we gain protection for the workers' rights that we've got, gain protection for the social chapter that we've got, the environmental sustainability regulations we've got, and all of those issues. But what I'm absolutely appalled by is the rise in racist attacks and racist violence over the past week within this country. This afternoon I went to the Polish Centre in Hammersmith to express my support, sympathy and solidarity to them, and recognise that the vote last week was a vote of anger, was a vote of desperation by many places around the country. Post-industrial Britain, of communities that were destroyed by the Tory government under Margaret Thatcher and John Major in the 1980s, still have high levels of unemployment, have still lost their economic viability because of the destruction of basic, very big, heavy industries of that period. A free market economy is not going to solve the problems of those areas. An interventionist economy that invests in those areas, invests in the infrastructure that's necessary, invests in the jobs that's necessary, is something that will help those communities and will ensure those young people in those communities that haven't got jobs, that do get good training but cannot carry that training on into developing work, do get some help and some support. So those are actually the general areas that we're putting forward. But I also want to say this about the culture and lives of our society. We have rights to health, to education, to housing, to voting, and all those things, not because anybody ever gave them to us, but because people struggled to achieve them. Struggled to achieve those rights historically, as they do all over the world. And in those struggles, we have benefited from them. And so, our campaign is about social justice. It is about expression. It is about the cultural values of our society. It is about understanding that every child deserves, of course, good school, good health, good housing, but every child also deserves the chance to learn music, to learn poetry, to learn painting, to learn art, to be able to express themselves in an open and free way. Because it's that sort of creative, dynamic society that is something that is very exciting and brings us all very interesting political time in this country. I was very honoured to be elected to lead the Labour Party last year. I've done my best over this year to develop the policy changes we want, to reach out to people in the way that we want, and recognise there are many in the party who may not completely agree with the direction I want to take us. But I also recognise that the mandate was given by hundreds of thousands of ordinary people joining in a political process, just as is happening across Europe, just as happening across the United States, because they want to see a politics that is more reflective of them and their lives, their hopes and their community of aspirations, rather than the economic orthodoxy of the retreat of the wealth to the wealthiest, that the poor may get poorer. It simply is immoral and wrong, the economic process that is being offered to us by the right within our society. Surely together we have strength. Surely together we can harness the technology we've got. Surely together we can be very strong and not be afraid of press barons who attack us. Not be afraid. Not be afraid of those who can only offer us greater and deeper inequality in society. It's mobilising people, mobilising free thinking, mobilising ideas in order to concentrate those into policies that can actually improve the lives of everybody in our society. That is why we contested the leadership of this party a year ago. That is why I'm very proud to be carrying on with that work and carrying on